If you like paper and dice games, chances are you also gravitate to what I would call adjacent fantasy media. And if you like the content of this channel, I'm gonna take a wild guess and say you're not opposed to that kind of media featuring protagonists whipping out the odd misanthropic, nihilistic one-liner while carrying around a grotesquely oversized sword and effectively moving through the world in a maelstrom of blood and guts. You see what I did? All while the world is coming to an end in an apocalyptic war or something of the sort around them. And of course the natural thing to ask is there maybe a paper and dice game that allows me to combine these interests? And the answer is yes, but it requires a sacrifice. Hello friends, Anderson here, and today I would like to present to you Sacrifice, a not really solo RPG, but a role-playing game that very firmly leans on a single player character, is in fact designed around the setup of one game master and one player character, so is therefore very, very easily adapted to solo play and in fact contains most of the meat and bones already. All you would need to throw in is a GM emulator of your choice, whether it be Mythic, whether it be the GM emulation section of Scarlet Heroes. And what you then end up with is the closest thing to emulating the narrative feel of Berserk. This is very much the impetus for this game. It wears its influences on its sleeves. But that is far from all it is. It is also a very genuinely well put together adaptation of D20 rules of a fairly old school archetype, modernized by throwing in some aspects of advanced greatest role-playing game of all time, plus a few elements of the current, the 5th edition, as in feats and such, and combat maneuvers. So if you like the feel of being a haunted protagonist chased by demonic forces through a grim, dark, fantastic world, while leaning on a system that takes a lot of cues from the early days of role-playing games, but throws in some of the better aspects of modern day design, then this is gonna be for you. Now, before I show it off to you, before I go into the flip through aspect of this, let me quickly state that this is something that I got as part of a Patreon reward, and that it's also available now in PDF form on itch and DriveThruRPG. It will be available in a printed version soon, but one of the things I cannot really overstate is that particularly now, Patreon support for independent creators is important. So I put the Patreon link for Black Oath down in the video description, and I would ask you to support creators if you can. If you have the financial means, then go out and become a patron of your favorite independent role-playing game designers. I do occasionally get messages on various channels asking me how to support me, to support this channel, and generally outside of subscribing to it and liking the videos, do that. Go and support the designers so I have games to play. Honestly, just go and do that because it's good, yeah? And with that out of the way, let's open up this booklet. So, we start off with the basics. What is Sacrifice? It's a D20 game. It's a retro clone compatible game, so it also plugs in fairly neatly with bestiaries, with source books of other types. It is a classless game according to this book. This is no longer strictly speaking true, because while you start out as the protagonist, as the branded class, what that is we get to later, there has already been an expansion on the Patreon, a commoner class, which would allow you to experience things from a very, very different power dynamic. The branded is fairly strong, fairly powerful. The commoner isn't really. And there is more expansions on the way. There is even official solo rules on the way, according to the latest Patreon update. So with solo rules incoming, with an errant knight class incoming, there is a lot of potential in this game for building upon the framework that is already here. Now, the branded. What is a branded? The idea here is that the protagonist class, the branded class, calls back to an integral part of the world building here, which is that there is an inquisition, a religious order that eradicates demonic influences, and that there is such a thing as demonic influences and the people that worship them or serve them. And the branded combines the two. You have the background of an inquisitor, but you were taken as a sacrifice. You were taken in by a demon worshipping cult or some such and branded. And this brand also puts in a very nice narrative spin on the world. More to that later. But for now, what's important to know is through sheer grit and guts, I should really stop using that word, you have managed to escape. And you are now hunted not only by the demonic cult, but by your former Inquisition buddies, because you are now a walking demon aggregator, and that brand does bad things to its surroundings and to you. So that's the basic premise of the game. Now, how does it play? It's a die-20 game. It goes against difficulty classes that is fairly reminiscent to current age 5e mechanics. It uses advantage, disadvantage. So effectively, if you roll a dice with advantage, you can roll again and use the best result. Or if you roll a dice with disadvantage, you roll again and use the worst result. It does support critical hits and failures fairly integrally. There is some tables here that give you a lot to play with in regards to crits and such. And it's got a mechanic for opposed rolls. So that's pretty much so far so standard, but not really for an OSR game, I would say. So there's already some influences there that a purist would just run away from, which is fine because, you know, doesn't need to be for everybody. Now, character creation, you roll 3d6 6 times for each stat, and then you allocate the die results to the appropriate stat as you want to build your character. It's a human-centric dark fantasy game, so for now all characters are human and all characters are the protagonist, so they start off stronger. They start off at level 3. You also got some coin to play with and some details of your character to work out, as is, I think, relatively normal for any kind of RPG character creation. And you get some supporting material in there. You get some world building in the back of the book, so there is quite some, you know, what's your place of origin, what's your previous experience, all of that is in there. You can generate this. Ability scores, ability modifiers, that is relatively standard D&D, AD&D, with the from -3 to +3 on a scale of 3 to 18. Now, one thing that makes your character special is the brand gives you some additional powers, and those express themselves in being able to kind of customize an additional +2 for your character by choosing one of 4 options, whether you have Titanic Strengths, Lightning Reflexes, Unbreakable Will, or Boundless Vitality. You also get some additional powers or class quirks as a branded. One is a mechanism where if you reach 0 HP, it isn't quite over yet, so you have like a recovery mechanism that might allow you to pop back into life. You have a luck pool equal to half your level, which you can use to automatically pass a saving throw, for instance. That is quite handy to mitigate some of the danger of the randomness if you're a single PC. And you have a mastery die, which is somewhat reminiscent of the fray dice in Scarlet Heroes, but it works not exactly the same way because the hit point system here is a bit more classic. So you don't just go subtract hit dice like you do in Scarlet Heroes, but you actually roll the dice pools for the enemies you fight, and then you subtract the damage you do. So the mastery die here gives you a die 4 to roll as automatic damage that you dish out to any enemy that is below your level, and that's automatic damage, and it works to sort of reflect the fact that your character is a bit of a stupendous badass and is constantly lugging a ginormous sword around and bashing it left and right and just dealing damage without really focusing down a single enemy. As you level up, you accumulate more skill points, more feats. Yes, there are skills in this as well, so this is another addition. This is why I threw in the comparison to AD&D a little bit as well, because it's not fully fledged skill system like 5e, it's not a fully fledged feat system like 5e, but it is fairly close to what I remember from 1e or 2e AD&D, and I like that. Skills we have what I would assume to be the usual, the norm, but we have a few specific ones that pertain more to the world building here, such as heretical knowledge, and also skills like culture, history, and religion to allow you to draw on the background of the world a little bit more. You start out as a branded with 2 weapon proficiencies and 1 armor proficiency, so you can customize a character in a certain direction, and you get 3 feats. And remember when I said that the game wears its influences on its sleeves a bit? Look at the feat. Colossal Wielder, which is effectively pick a 2-handed weapon, make it comically oversized, and go to town with it. So this is, yeah, if you know the manga, you know the thing. Combat is interestingly spiced up in that it has a stamina mechanic, which is D8 plus level, and combat maneuvers, which cost a certain amount of stamina to execute. And you can only do 1 maneuver per round, and that allows you to pick from this list of combat maneuvers and do a few badass things in combat. This is, to me, a little bit reminiscent of the Souls games, where the stamina management is part of the fun, and which also are heavily inspired by the Berserk manga series. Hidetaka Miyazaki is a big fan of Berserk, so it's probably not a coincidence. Now, as mentioned before, you have your background generation tables here. You can also flesh out, for instance, who betrayed you, so who made you the sacrifice. And between a lot of this, you can generate quite an interesting and unique and customized individual character. So even if there's like only 1 branded class, there are a fairly large amount of different directions you can take that class in, and that adds a lot of replay value alone just for this 1 class, and like there are more classes coming. More customization options on this set of pages, which allow you to explore where the brand is located and what happens if the brand takes over. That is also one aspect that the brand carries. It's a bit of a multi-tool, not in the best way. So for one, it allows you to send demonic creatures nearby, but also does damage you for 1 hit point. If that happens, you can pinpoint the location and the number, I think. But unfortunately, it also attracts the spirit of the restless dead that occasionally take over, and then you go berserk, I guess. So you can roll here to see what happens when you temporarily lose control of your character. So it also embraces that kind of hopelessness of the scenario where you are the branded protagonist, and if you stay too long in one place and things go a bit awry on your die roll to keep the spirits of the dead from possessing you, you'll probably do terrible things to those around you. So the way I envision a branded to be is sort of a wanderer by choice. Not only are you hunted, you're also not very safe to be around. That's, by the way, another aspect of the brand, that the brand also creates the sort of an instability with the barrier between the liminal space where the demonic entities make their home and reality. So if there's already an overlap created between demonic space and real space, and the walls are wearing a bit thin, and the branded shows up, it's gonna collapse. So you are classically the protagonist. When you show up, bad things happen just by dint of you showing up. This is very nicely reflected in the world building here, in the design of the class. I like it very much. Going into the gear section, you get some shopping funds and some shopping that you can do to customize yourself in a certain direction. What kind of a branded do you want to be? What weapons do you wear? What armor do you wear? What other stuff do you carry? Skill checks, ability checks, saving throws, all of that is, I think, relatively familiar. There are some permutations here where it also differentiates between human saving throws, bestial saving throws, demonic saving throws, if that applies. And combat in the, I would say, rigidity of the turn sequence, as it is outlined here. Determine surprise, establish positions, roll initiative, take turns, begin the next round. That reminds me the most, I would say, of OSR games like Sword and Wizardry, or just the whole BX revival. That is, I think, fairly reminiscent. I think the only thing it doesn't really do is it doesn't really have like the range phase before the melee phase. But it is all in all something you can quite easily pick up and play if you are generally familiar with what D20 games do that are of a bit of an older blend. With, of course, the added combat maneuvers thrown in. That is, I think, a fairly enticing proposal to make this a lot more interesting. Now, we already talked about critical hits. We have some critical hit tables by type of damage, which is, I think, also a fairly nice classic callback. It's not Rollmaster like D100 tables with absurd result where you fall over an invisible turtle, but it is definitely a workable amount of things that can happen if you crit. We also have a fumble table. There is a morale component, and there is a component, of course, outlining what happens when you die, when you lose health, etc., etc. Dealing with injury, wounds, a fatigue mechanic, which introduces a bit of a survival element to the hex crawl rules that come in a bit later, and then the travel procedures, which are effectively the hex crawl rules that come in a bit later. So there is already baked in here a reflection of how to generate content for yourself. So it is already fairly GM-less by design. It doesn't necessarily need the GM. If you do need the input that a GM can usually provide, you can, as I said, reflect that through Mythic generally. That works. Asking the questions, using the oracle prompts, the word association game, that generally works quite well here. Now, the travel rules divide the day into 3 segments: morning, evening, and night. And you have a number of options of what you can do in each phase. You can pick an action and then declare what action you can do. Partly the survival aspect again, to alleviate fatigue. You'll have to make camp, you'll have to rest. You also need a phase to travel. You need a phase to hunt, forage, to explore, etc., etc. And there is a number of tables that support you in finding out what happens when you set camp, what happens when you travel, what happens when you explore a place, and what's the weather like, etc., etc. So there is, even on these few pages, there is a fair amount of basic input for your hex crawling, and since it is a system that is fairly adaptable, you can also probably quite easily plug in your favorite D100 hex content generation tables, as long as they fit the theme. Now, given that this world is a fairly ugly place and you are not necessarily the nicest and cleanest of people, there is a corruption aspect to this that can befall you depending on what you witness, what you do, and then manifests in a mark of corruption that is also provided to you here in a D20 table. The world itself is somewhat Western fantasy with 2 main factions warring over a no man's land in the middle in between. One is somewhat influenced by the HRE, the Holy Roman Empire, with more of Germanic flavor to it. The other one is somewhat more reminiscent of, I think the vibe I'm getting is more like French, and those respectively are the Kingdom of Bavaria and the Cadenor Dominion. It goes into a bit of detail also, of course, on the Church of the Burning Light, which is the organization that you once served as an Inquisitor if you do play as a Branded, and that still has quite a significant influence on the world. That also has its own area that it governs and rules. I can quickly give you a glimpse of the world map such as it is. So Dominion here, Kingdom here, No Man's Land in between, and some adjacent places that are roughly mentioned but not fully fleshed out in the book. And those 2 factions that are a bit more fleshed out, they are currently locked into a 100 Years War that affects this no man's land area, which lends itself quite well to play, because that is, I think, an area where, well, escaped Branded probably has an easier time avoiding heat and hiding out. So while the game doesn't tell you to go play in the no man's land, it is to some extent a place that suggests itself, and it also has its own set of tables and descriptions that it comes with here in the rulebook, so you have some more material. One aspect, again lifted somewhat from the inspiration for this from Berserk, is the aspect of mercenary companies. The 2 warring parties have, of course, at some point run out of their own armies and are now mostly sending mercenary companies into war alongside their still existing armies. And you have a naming table for the mercenary companies, and they're somewhat important to the game here, just as they are to Berserk. There is in fact a map of the no man's land here as well, and the accompanying set of tables and what happens if you stumble across a battlefield, an active battlefield, things like that. Variety of encounter tables and what type of creature you can meet, what kind of situation you can run into if you run into a bunch of soldiers, what are they up to, etc, etc. Some additional tables for NPC generation, so there is again already a decent amount of solo-friendly stuff in here, plus a series of weekly events you can generate to make the world come alive a bit more by rolling on it on a weekly basis. There's also adventure seeds here and character events that can happen, so again, without a GM, you already have some specific sets of tables that can lend you some ideas in which direction to carry the story. Rounding it off are some tables on what kind of treasures you can find on NPCs or in various places, and a set of beasties that you can run into that follow the general flair of the world building. There is also a category for apostles, again a nice callback to the manga. That is, let's say, a special kind of antagonist that exists in two forms. One is the human form, one is the monstrous form, and what they are effectively is the pinnacle of demonic corruption. There's a character sheet at the end of the book. I printed it out. You can download it off the Black Oath website, and I am rather curious what more there is to come, because I very much like this game. If you too like the game, consider grabbing a copy, consider becoming a patron, and then we'll hopefully get more of this good stuff in the future. So that was it from me. Thank you very much for watching. I'll catch you next time, and bye for now.